Each race enslaved by mind flayers has been subjected to a unique, horrible experiment, and thus each was left with a different type of trauma. The Gith escaped with little mental scarring, aside from their new psionic powers, but the Duergar had completely lost their emotions by the time they rebelled. Quaggoths, Darrow, and Grimlocks all had their minds destroyed beyond repair, retaining nothing of their former selves. But the most interesting survivors of the Mind Flayers are the Kuo-Toa, whose lives of mental bombardment led them to fanatically worship gods of their own creation. Welcome to Critically Misused, a show where we look at misunderstood aspects of D&D. On this episode, we'll be covering Kuo-Toa and their dangerous, world-shaping madness. Kuo-Toa had lives before the Mind Flayers kidnapped them. They were a coastal fish race, perhaps not too different from the Lokafas we know today. But their peace didn't last, as they were captured by Mind Flayers and subjected to horrible forms of psionic engineering. After generations of such experiments, the Mind Flayers deemed them useless and released them back into their homes, confused and chronically damaged. Their new neighbors, the Sea Elves, found them disgusting and drove them out of the water. Humans hated them as well and drove them deep into the Underdark, where the Drow hunted them to near extinction. Attacked from all directions and unable to defend themselves, the Kuo-Toa became desperate. Knowingly or unknowingly, they channeled all their mental power together to create new gods to protect them. Kuo-Toa deities are born rather strangely. When a single Kuo-Toa believes in something strongly, which happens quite often, considering they've gone mad, the Kuo-Toa can bring their creation to life as a deity of their own. If they can convince other Kuo-Toa that their god is real, the deity gains even more power, and thus even more followers. Their pantheon is a sick museum of twisted gods, born from the minds of the psychologically unwell. Yet still, the Kuo-Toa worship them, creating more and more as the centuries pass by. These unnerving humanoid sardines paint a very uncomfortable picture of religion in the Forgotten Realms. Instead of divine power being the reason for worship, it's worship that creates divine power. How many of our gods were created by the Kuo-Toa's minds? How many by our own? The Forgotten Realms and greater D&D lore provides us with an answer. Yes, a god's power is proportional to the amount of worshippers they have, hence the goddess of agriculture being the most powerful deity in an agrarian society. However, most aren't created from nothing. They may have started as adventurers, such as Kelemvor, as already established extraplaners, such as Corellon or Orcus, or as the demigod children of established gods, such as Ulistre. The Kuo-Toa's gods are unique only in their creation. Nevertheless, I see Kuo-Toa as a harsh reflection of religion in the Forgotten Realms. They're so willing to beg for protection from great and powerful threats that they worship statues, symbols, mere promises of divine protection. The same way desperate humans worship krakens, dragons, and liches. From what I understand, Eberron leaves it ambiguous as to whether belief or real gods grant divine powers. The gods of Theros were canonically born from the will of mortals, yet those same mortals worship them as creators. Spelljammer's astral sea is littered with the bodies of dead, forgotten gods. We need them to protect us, and they need us to exist. The Kuo-Toa are terrifying because they reveal a horror present all along. What I've covered thus far has been the canonical approach to running Kuo-Toa, but it is by no means the only approach. Bashew describes an intriguing homebrew ritual with mechanics for birthing new gods. He also implies that the Kuo-Toa may be the source of all gods in your homebrew world, a take that strengthens their unique brand of horror. A villain that harnessed their powers would also be fun to play with. I imagine a lich keeping Kuo-Toa in jars, torturing them to create an army of gods or god killers. However you choose to run them, keep in mind Kuo-Toa are at their best when they recontextualize what the players already know about religion. They, like the Lovecraft novel that inspired them, instill a creeping horror of self-reflection. Are we really so sure of the divinity of our gods? Or are we merely hiding behind the symbols we find comforting? Good food for thought, regardless of what the answer turns out to be. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you've made it this far, consider dropping a like and subscribing, and perhaps suggest a monster or mechanic you'd like to see me cover in the comments below. I know I get sentimental a lot at the end of these videos, but I really can't thank you enough for your support you've given me during this OGL nonsense. We're past that, hopefully, so you can expect more frequent uploads, as I've gotten my motivation back. Safe travels, until we meet again.